here. I'm just going to go over here and get a bag. I'll be back in a moment. Thanks, mate. It's quite a heavy one. It'll become apparent, don't worry. Yes, so, week 2 of Esther. Long text, lots going on, and we'll get into it in a minute. But first, what I want to do is take you on a journey back in time, 20 years ago, when I was at school. And this was specifically, as my parents are here, I'm going to look this way and this way. This was specifically in statistics. And it was a lesson that we had every other week, and it was in GCSE year, so I was like 14, 15 years old. And this lesson came before lunchtime. So like none of us wanted to be there because we'd just finished PE, so we're all hot and sweaty and like ties around our neck. And we just like starving, so we want to get out as quick as possible. And we didn't like stats anyway, because if anyone's a statistician, grateful for you. But for us, and for me particularly, not bothered. So what it meant was in that lesson, we'd play up. We would just have a laugh. We wouldn't listen to the teacher. We'd talk about anything other than graphs and stats. And bless her, she would try and teach us, but we just didn't care. And it came to a head, this one lesson, where at the end of the lesson, the bell rang. And obviously, we all wanted to go, so we've already got our bags packed. And we all try and rush out the door. And the teacher goes, no one's leaving. You're all staying in for lunch. You've all misbehaved. None of you have listened to us. And now your punishment is to stay behind. And we were indignant. We thought it was very unfair. We wanted to go to lunch, and we felt that someone was abusing their power of position. And so what happened was 3 things. The first is that there was a group of girls. So there was 20 in the class. 16 of us were boys. 4 of them were girls. And they clubbed together and used the power of their persuasion to persuade the teacher that actually, miss, we've behaved quite well. It's the boys that are the issue. And that worked because the teacher opened the door. And so then you can imagine then, 16 boys left, raging in anger. And my mate Johnny stood up. Now Johnny, he was 15, but I swear he hit puberty when he left the womb. Because he was like 6'5", built like a brick house. And he cornered this teacher. And so he's now using his like power of posture to like argue our point. And so this teacher's like cornered by Johnny, going, okay, yeah, I didn't, this is kind of escalated quite quickly. And then there was me. And I saw an opportunity. It was a ground floor classroom. It was in the summer. The window was open. I had a brief moment, and I took it, and I ran. And I jumped out the window, and I was at the queue, ready for my pizza before any of my mates could say, where's Tim? And I say that because we all have power. And we all get to use that power in different ways. The teacher in the story used her power of position. My mate Johnny used his power of posture. The girls used the power of persuasion. And I used the power of my athletic physique. So we all have roles, don't we? And all those roles come with varying degrees of power. Some of us are parents in the room, and we know that we have power in the moment where it's, we're telling a child off. It doesn't feel like we've got power, but we have. And then some of us are actually parents now of teenagers, and we realize that power has dwindled because they've got a will of their own. Some of us are siblings, and we recognize that we have power to influence our brothers and sisters, to help them through seasons of life. Maybe we know that we're really good friends, and we recognize that we have power in supporting our friends through really difficult things. Maybe in your workplace, you're a manager, and actually you have position, and therefore that position comes with power. You can determine the culture of your team and how people feel at work. Maybe you're not a manager, but you're a co-worker. And you get to shape the dynamic of the workplace through how you collaborate or how you compete for the next promotion. Maybe you're just an employee, influencing decisions through your actions and contributions, and you feel like you're the lowest of the low, and you don't feel like you have any power. And so if I do have any, how do I use it? Maybe it's just actually in the community. We don't go to work anymore because we've retired, and so the role that we play Monday to Saturday is kind of a community member as well as a grandparent, and sets a vendetta against one man, and then it becomes a campaign to annihilate an entire people. So his power is rooted in retaliation, but it's also rooted in deception. So Haman manipulates power to serve a personal agenda. So when he goes to King Xerxes with this master plan to eradicate not just Mordecai, but his whole people, he kind of starts by telling the truth, and then he tells a half-truth, and then he just tells a blatant lie. So he goes to King Xerxes and he points out the truth that the Jews, the Jewish people, are scattered and dispersed across the empire. And that's true. They are. But then he claims that their laws are different from other people, which is half true. Because this is religiously true, but the law in Deuteronomy stated that the Jewish people were to obey the state laws. So they weren't necessarily always against the state, but sometimes it looked like they were because their religious practice was slightly different to the Persians or the Babylonians. So it's half-truth. And then he tells a blatant lie. He accuses the Jews of disobedience to the king's commands, but actually what he's telling King Xerxes is that it's based off one man's decision not to honor the king's command. And so he takes one man's decision not to and extrapolates that across a whole people group. So he tells a blatant lie. And then he concludes with this ultimate distortion, and he says it's no longer, or it's not in the king's interest to allow them to remain. And so by twisting facts to align with his personal agenda, Haman manipulates Xerxes into becoming complicit in his schemes. So it's rooted in retaliation, it's compromised by deception, but finally it's influenced by human wisdom. So Haman has this power, and even in his planning, he demonstrates a reliance on human methods rather than seeking divine wisdom. Now, he wouldn't because he's an Agagite. But the wisdom that he consults is that of astrologers, that of human wisdom. And so we read, haven't we, the casting of the lot, the casting of the pur, which reflects his belief in fate. So he's trying to choose a day, when will this edict be rolled out? And he consults astrologers, and they cast the pur, and it chooses a day. But what he doesn't realize is that human wisdom is folly. But the wisdom of God is true wisdom. And in Proverbs, we read this, in Proverbs 16:33, that the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. And so the irony here is that Haman is consulting human wisdom and not realizing that actually what's happening is God is still in control. But nevertheless, his power is influenced by human wisdom. And so Haman's use of power teaches us that power rooted in anger, compromised by deception, or influenced by human wisdom will always lead to ruin. And so while Haman abuses the power he has been given, Xerxes shows us the danger of avoiding power altogether. Because another way of using power is abdication. It's actually not using it. It's choosing not to engage with it at all. And we all know what it's like to be on the receiving end of someone who abdicates their power, because we've all stepped in dog poo. The moment when that happens, it happened to me like last year in the summer outside my house in Cheltenham when we used to live there. And there was a prolific, I don't know who it was, but there was a dog. I don't know which dog it was, but there was just everywhere around our streets, there was just this massive turd. And this one day I missed it, and I was wearing flip-flops. And I stepped right into it, and it went in between my toes. And it reeked, and like for days I was washing my feet, and I couldn't get the smell out of my nostrils. And this dog owner had basically abdicated their responsibility to do something about the mess in front of them. And in doing so, had caused me harm, had caused my family harm, had caused my car harm. I think it still whiffs, actually, if you go in there. But ignoring the mess of that one is responsible for doesn't make it disappear. It just ensures that others get caught in it. You see, Xerxes, when he's approached by Haman, he abdicates any responsibility that he has. He doesn't even confirm with Haman who the people are that are going to be killed. And in doing so, the irony is that he's basically allowing an edict to be law that both his wife now, who's Esther, it will be killed. Because she is also a Jew. He doesn't know it, but is also a Jew. But he doesn't confirm who the people are. He abdicates the responsibility to find out. And also in handing over his signet ring, he is effectively allowing Haman to dictate orders as if Haman was king. Now, he does this, Xerxes, from a wounded position. So some commentators think that before Esther, that what's happened is Xerxes tried to conquer Greece and he's failed. And so he's a wounded leader, wounded by defeat. He tried to use his power, but he was unsuccessful. And we read last week, didn't we, around him trying to bring Queen Vashti into his splendorous courtyard. And that failed. And so maybe it was defeat after defeat after defeat, which has caused him to go, actually, do you know what? I'm abdicating power now because it's just too painful. Every time I try and use my power, I don't know. This is an argument from silence. But what is clear is that he's abdicating his power. He gives up his responsibility. And it feels like an act of self-preservation. It's almost as if he stays silent to remain neutral in order to experience another defeat from conflict. And as a quote that's often attributed to Edmund Burke goes, he says this: all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing. All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing. And as a national church, we've learned, haven't we, recently, through whether it's the Macon report or whether it's the Fiona Scolding report on the abuse of Mike Pilavachi, that all it takes for evil to continue is for good men and women to do nothing. So Xerxes' abdication of power teaches us that neglecting power doesn't absolve us from mess. It burdens others with it. And so while Haman abuses power and Xerxes abdicates his, Mordecai models another way to wield it. At the beginning of our reading, we learn that Mordecai halted the plot to assassinate King Xerxes. Mordecai's power in that moment doesn't come from his position, doesn't come from his posture, doesn't necessarily come from his ability to persuade, but from what he knows. He holds critical knowledge. And yet notice how Mordecai wields that power. The idea that knowledge is power, and he has this critical bit of information that there's a plot to kill King Xerxes. Well, instead of using it to further his own vengeance agenda, or using it to abdicate responsibility and turn a blind eye, he uses it to bring life, quite literally, by uncovering the plot and saving Xerxes' life. And then at the end of chapter 2, the narrative seems to set us up to think that Mordecai, because he's exposed this plot, will then be honored for his loyalty and his heroic actions. But his efforts, yes, they are recorded in the Chronicle of Annals, or the Chronicles of Persia, yet his faithfulness largely goes unnoticed. He's overlooked. He's passed over by human power. And in stark contrast, Haman, he's elevated to a position of honor, not for his merit, but by a royal decree. And so he uses his power, does Mordecai, to remain faithful even when he's overlooked, even when he's passed over. Because he uses his power to resist that which opposes God. Mordecai uses his power of his convictions to stand firm against Haman the Agagite. And while Mordecai had previously demonstrated loyalty to the state by exposing the plot against Xerxes in chapter 2, he now refuses to bow before Haman, as refusal rooted in obedience to God's declaration against He refused to bow down before Haman because a refusal rooted in obedience to God's declared opposition against Amalek, the people of Amalek. He's like, no, I know that you're an Amalekite ultimately, and actually I'm a follower of God. And so to bow down to you would be to be disobedient to God. So he uses his power of convictions to resist that which opposes God. So Mordecai's use of power teaches us that true power brings life to others. That true power remains faithful even when we're overlooked, even when we're passed over by human power. And it stands firm in obedience to God, refusing to compromise God's plan for personal gain. And so Mordecai shows us a glimpse of how power can be redeemed. But Jesus embodies it in its fullness. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, we read this, that Jesus called them, the disciples, and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life for many." Jesus subverts power. He uses power to serve, and he wants us to do the same. Because power is best used when it's laid down to serve others. Power is best used when it's laid down to serve others. Now, at the beginning, I shared that we all have power in varying different places and spaces that we find ourselves in. And that rises and falls depending on the context that we're in. So right now, I am a leader in this church. I have a microphone in my hand. I have a lanyard on. You've listened to me in and out for the last 20 minutes or so. Thank you. But what that means is that right now, I have a lot of power. And if I drop this into a bowl full of water, there would be quite an impact. But the same me, if I went home and I told this to my 3-year-old daughter, power. And then somewhere in between, there are other spaces where that power would be bigger than there, but also smaller than. So I can help my daughter at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when she's hurt herself, and I can calm her down. But at 3 a.m. in the morning, I'm no use. I've little power. Do you get what I'm saying? But the reality is, no matter how much power we have in the roles and places and the spaces that we find ourselves, tomorrow, Tuesday, it all has impact. Whether I drop that stone into a bowl of water or that rock, they make a splash. They make a ripple effect. And so we all have power, and Jesus wants us to use that power in the best way by laying it down to serve others And we might be sitting there thinking, well, Tim, that's fine for you to say that because you right now have lots of power. So you can serve lots of people. But me, you don't know what it's like when I get home. I've got no power at all. I've got no power to serve anybody. And I hear that, but I would graciously challenge and say, but you can still, there is power in there. And you can lay that power down to serve others. And so when it comes to power, none of us know, really, how much we have. And the other irony with power is that we don't know how much we have, and what we have is never enough. We always want more. And what matters isn't how much power we have, but how we choose to use it. And the temptation, if we're really, really, really honest, is that we're often tempted to use power like Haman and Xerxes because we're human and we're faulted and frail. And as Andy Crouch says in his book Culture Makers, he writes this: the only real antidote to the temptations of power is choosing to spend power in the opposite of the way the world encourages us to spend it. Not on getting to the sources of additional power or on securing our own round-the-clock sense of comfort and control, but spending it on getting closer to the relatively powerless. Power is best used when it's laid down to serve others. In a moment, we're going to take communion. And before we do that, let me just close by saying this. This is another quote from Henri Nouwen. He says, the way of the Christian leader or parent, grandparent, wife, husband, manager, CEO, those are my words, is not the way of upward mobility in which our world is invested so much, but the way of downward mobility ending on the cross. And so as we approach communion, as Rich comes in a moment to share, to help us with the words that we'll say and minister communion to us, we're invited into the very heart of the gospel, a story of power, not wielded to control, but laid down to serve. Jesus, the one who spoke stars into motion, held all authority in heaven and on earth, yet he didn't grasp that power, but he laid it down in order to serve others, humbling himself, taking the form of a servant and offering his life for the sake of others, for the sake of you and me. And the bread and wine today will be symbols of this subverted power. His body broken for you. His blood poured out for you. And this is the kind of power that transforms the world. This is the kind of power that transforms your workplace, your families, your streets, your children. It's a power that's laid down to serve others. And at this table, we're not only reminded of what Jesus did, but we're reminded that we're called to embody it. This is a table of humility. It's a table of sacrifice. It's a table of grace. It's here that we remember that Jesus didn't just lay down his power, but he picked up a cross, showing us that the greatest strength is found in not serving ourselves, but serving others. That power is best used when it's laid down to serve others. So in a moment, you'll be invited to come and receive the bread and wine. And my encouragement to you is to come not because you're powerful, but because he is. Come not because you have power, but because you need his. Come and be reminded that the power of Christ is not in what he took, but what he gave. And as we eat and drink, let us reflect on his example and commit ourselves to use the power that we have, whether it looked like a big rock or a small stone, and to lay it down in order to serve others.